Roger. All lift birds, get more altitude, get more altitude. Let's make it a steep approach in here.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, 42 is taking fire. That's the front. You went down, it's taking fire.
The other flight say
You get recovery.
Okay, 10, I'm on a heading of 300 on that 3,000 feet.
Roger, Roger, I'm taking fire. Just get all the altitude you can coming over those ridge lines.
That's Charlie 3. This is reconnaissance.
Helicopter went in. Burning smoke. 28 or 20 going down. Roger. Let's get the guns back out here on station.
During this program, you will meet some of the bravest combat aviators who've ever flown, the Army helicopter pilots of Vietnam. Indiana farm boys, urban tough guys, from the boy next door to the sons of immigrants, soft-spoken Southerners, brisk Yankees, all volunteered to fly helicopters in a burgeoning jungle war on the other side of the world. The war had started before many of these pilots were born. When Vietnam was restored to French colonial rule at the end of World War II, those Vietnamese who had fought the Japanese invaders then fought the French, finally driving them out of the country after the fall of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The country was then partitioned into North and South Vietnam. The helicopter war started in 1961, when 2 U.S. Army helicopter units equipped with Vertol H-21s arrived to airlift South Vietnamese soldiers into battles against the insurgent Viet Cong. In 1962, the brand new turbine-powered Bell HU-1, immediately nicknamed the Huey, was used for gunship support of the H-21 operations. Used in World War II and Korea to save lives, helicopters had never before been used in direct combat. Army pilots soon learned that their thin-skinned and underpowered helicopters were very vulnerable to enemy fire. In 1962, 7 helicopters and 5 aviators were lost to enemy fire in one day at Ap Bac. This led to the development of new air mobility tactics and improvements in aircraft. The dramatic buildup in American forces began in 1965, when the first completely air-mobile combat division, the 1st Air Cavalry, was sent to An Khe. This 15,000-man unit brought with it more than 400 helicopters and 10,000 combat troopers. The war was now an American war, and into the breach of battle began flowing thousands of brand new Army aviators, volunteers from all across America, and they would keep coming for nearly 10 more years. This then is the first-hand account of the men who lived, breathed, and died in Vietnam as Army helicopter pilots. Most of the Army helicopter pilots who flew in Vietnam had never seen the cockpit of an airplane, much less a helicopter, before they got to flight school.
The Army had an ad they used to run in magazines. I think they were mostly in car magazines like Road and Track and things like that, and it would say, you can be a pilot in the Army with a high school diploma, and it had this young guy holding a helmet standing in front of a Cobra. And we said, that sounds cool. Let's go fly Cobras in the Army. So we literally went down and signed up the next day.
I entered the Army with a draft board on my tail. I had gone through a tragedy in my life of a wife and son being killed in a car accident right while I was in college and college years, and ended up not having a student deferment and a family, and so enlisted in the Army to do something as opposed to being an infantryman as a draftee.
I grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, and a friend of mine and I were in some trouble down at Virginia Beach. after I graduated from college, and the good old judge down there gave me a few options, but being in the military would be one of those. So I enlisted in the Army as a private, and went to basic training, advanced individual training in the Army, and then immediately after that, Officers Candidate School. I came back to a training center at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And I worked longer hours in that training center than I ever worked in my life. And I was sitting in my orderly room one day in my office, and I thought, I got to get out of here. So I called over the testing center, and I spoke to a sergeant and said, could I come over and take the flight school test? He said, we need to study. I said, I don't want to study. I'll take my chances. I have nothing to lose by taking it right now. So I drove over there, took the test at night, at whatever it was, like at 7 o'clock at night. About 3 days later, I called him. He said, you passed that test.
I was at an officer candidate school at Fort Sill, and shortly before graduation, I'm not sure the time frame, they actually gave us a piece of paper to look at that basically had all the schools at the Army that we could go to when we got out of OCS. So not really being really worried about what I was going to do, and I just checked every block. And one started right at the top, Special Forces, Airborne, Ranger, Flight School.
A few had learned to fly small planes at grass strips and little airports around the country.
I soloed on my 16th birthday. I got my private pilot's license when I was 17. Flew with crop dusters for a while. When I graduated from high school, I went straight into a junior college in a town nearby. Continued to fly, worked at an airport. So my whole interest was in aviation. This recruiter grabbed me and said, hey, if you want to fly, he says, you can get into warrant officer flight training and fly helicopters. And I didn't know really what a helicopter was at the time, and said, terrific.
I wanted to be an aviator, and the Army was offering a very good program whereby they would train you and make you an officer and then send you to Vietnam.
I was actually in college and doing not a whole lot, and I decided that I should go in the service and try it. So I went down to the recruiter, and I was standing in the hallway waiting for the Air Force recruiter to get there. And the Army recruiter showed up, and he goes, well, what are you doing here, son? And I said, well, I'm going to go fly jets. And he goes, you're not going to fly jets, you know. Do you have a college degree? And I went, no. And he said, you're not going to fly jets. You're going to be a jet mechanic. You want to do that? And I went, no. He goes, you want to fly helicopters? And I said, well, you mean like on TV, like the whirlybirds? And he goes, yeah, that's it. He goes, we'll have you flying in 6 weeks. And I went, really? Okay, that sounds neat. So I signed up, and away I went.
I'd had this infatuation with things of the air before I even came in the Army. I was an electrical lineman for Southern California Edison, and I really wanted to learn to fly, so I poked some money away in the bank and went down to Santa Monica Airport and took flying lessons. So before I even enlisted in the Army, I had about 30 hours of flying. I had a slight problem with my vision, though, and I didn't think I'd ever be able to fly once I got in the Army until one day after I got through OCS and was an artillery lieutenant at Fort Carson. I got a physical back that had 20/20 vision, and I ran that down to the flight surgeon's office, and he said, okay, we'll put in the application, and I got flight school.
Before they could wear Army aviator wings, they would first have to get through the U.S. Army Primary Helicopter School at Fort Walters, Texas.
When I drove through the gates to Fort Walters and I saw those two mounted helicopters, the H-23 and the TH-55, both of which were training aircraft used at Walters, my thought was nothing other than, I'm going to get one of those.
The sky was just covered with little trainee pilots and little bitty helicopters, OH-13s, OH-23s, and I was just amazed at how many there were and how organized they were and disorganized at the same time.
When we first got to Fort Walters, Texas, I wondered if I'd done the right thing, because when our buses pulled up out front, there were all these guys standing around the different company areas laughing, waving us off, saying, go back, go back. And they had us all sitting on the bus listening to a brief speech about, welcome to Fort Walters. This is the home of the Army Primary Helicopter Training Center. You have 30 seconds to get off my bus. And we all fell out and fell into formation on the hot Texas sun.
When I signed up for the Warrant Officer program, I had not flown anything. I'd never been in an airplane. My first flight was actually at Fort Walters. I was in a TH-55A, which was the smallest of the three trainers they were using at that time. The pilot, the student pilot, sat in the right seat, and the instructor was in the left seat. And we weren't in the air very long with the doors off. And he said, "Take the cyclic and give me a right-hand turn." So I grabbed the cyclic, and we'd been cautioned about how sensitive. So I remembered what they told me. I just barely leaned the cyclic to the right, and the helicopter started a gentle bank. And as I was coming around to the right, he proceeded to light up this Tampa Nugget cigar. And if you think about how people light cigars, he didn't just light it, but he was really drawing on that thing to make sure it was lit well and just fill the cockpit up with smoke. I'm sweating like a pig in the hot Texas sun. And I'm in this turn, and I'm going, and I'm starting to get green and go, oh boy, this is a mistake. So he gets a cigar lit, puts it in his mouth, grabs the cyclic, slams it over to the right, and I'm hanging by the straps over Texas, and I said, oh crap, what am I doing here? And I'll never forget, he leveled the helicopter up, and he waited until he made eye-to-eye contact with me, and he said, "This is fun, ain't it?" And I said, "Yeah, it's a damn blast."
The skies over Fort Walters were crammed with Hiller H-23 and Hughes TH-55A trainers. Civilian flight instructors from Southern Airways taught basic helicopter maneuvers. The students learned how to hover, take off, and land.
Hovering actually is probably the most difficult part about flying the aircraft. You've got various forces and controls working against each other and with each other and for each other. Your anti-torque pedals, which you control with your feet, your collective, which controls the power and the pitch of the rotor blades, and then the cyclic, which controls the direction that the rotor blades tilt. So you put all this together, and it's like rubbing your stomach and walking downstairs and juggling at the same time, except that would be easier.
It was like magic. The IP had the controls. He pulled the collective, and it came off the ground, and it sat there just like a magic carpet off the ground. And he turned to me and he said, "You're an experienced pilot, just take this thing and hover it." It was no more than about 0.2 of 1 second before that aircraft was totally out of control, and the instructor had to take the controls back.
Because the Army taught its pilots to assume that their engine could fail or be shot out at any moment, they learned auto-rotations, the tricky maneuver of safely landing an unpowered helicopter. If a student did not solo by his 15th hour of instruction, he was usually washed out of flight training.
I soloed, I think, within about 8 hours of flying. You never think you're ready to solo. And we landed at this little airfield. He gets out. He's starting to unbuckle and getting out. I said, "Where are you going?" He goes, You solo, you're going to die." And I went, "What?" And that was it. So I went, took off and I soloed. It was great.
I was kind of a slow learner. I may have been in the last 8 or 9 people in my class that actually soloed. I tend to be that kind of person. Once I learned it, I got it. I never crashed one, because it was my fault.
Finally said to my instructor pilot, "Let me solo or I'm going to go over the end and won't be able to do it." He says, "Okay." So it was that little teeny TH-55, that little bubble. And I remember, when you take off, you're supposed to fly down the airfield straight. And I think I flew around the entire airfield sideways, all the way back around, and came in and put it down. And after I did that, I was golden after that.
Soloing, a high point in a student's career, was traditionally celebrated by throwing the candidate into a pond in the Texas countryside, or later into the swimming pool under the crossed rotor blades at the Holiday Inn in Mineral Wells. At the end of primary training, the student pilots were sent to Fort Rucker, Alabama, or Fort Stewart, Georgia, for advanced training. Tactical use of the helicopter in combat conditions was stressed in advanced training. the candidates were introduced to heavy, more complex helicopters, including the Sikorsky H-19 and Bell UH-1 Huey. Formation flying, simulated air assaults, overloaded conditions, advanced navigation techniques, and tactical instrument flying were taught until by their 200th hour of flight time, the candidates became, if they passed their final check rides, Army aviators and were awarded their wings.
I was so happy and excited, and I just don't have words. I knew I was about to go to Vietnam within 30 days of receiving my wings, but I didn't care. Let's go. I had my wings. You couldn't hurt me.
Most of the pilots would be headed straight for the jungles of Southeast Asia to fly in a war they knew little about. Some had grand send-offs from families who'd seen past generations go off to war. Some slipped away in the middle of the night so little ones left behind would be spared tearful goodbyes.
I was, painfully aware of there were no guarantees about coming back alive. In fact, one of my roommates from college had already died in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot. So I knew that there wasn't any guarantee that I'd ever see him again, and it was one of the most difficult parts of that departure. Was certainly saying goodbye to my wife, but looking down at a 3-month-old son and wondering whether I'd ever see him again.
I was 21 years old, absolutely apolitical. I was an Army officer, and this is what I was trained to do, and quite frankly, I was excited to go.
My father, being a 22-year Army veteran, he thought it was important that we get to the airport in time. And if there's ever a flight that you can afford to miss, it'd be the one that's going to take you to a war.
I was at my mom and dad's place. My sister was still living home at the time, and I had a brother, my next older brother, Daryl, was working at home at that time, and he was going to take my car. And I can't remember what we were doing that night. I remember eating dinner with them. It was pretty quiet. My mother was, she was probably more emotional than I was at the time. She knew what the risks were. Dad never said much. I just remember going out the door, he just told me to keep my head down. Don't do anything stupid. That was the last thing he said when I walked out the door the next morning. My sister, I remember I hugged her and she kissed me on the cheek, and she just said, "Make sure you come back." I said, "I will." And I walked out the door, I was crying. And I think back at those moments saying that could have been the last time I saw anybody in my family.
They traveled by ship and by plane, some on freighters. With the Hueys they would fly cocooned in plastic on the decks. All wondered what they would see when they got to Vietnam.
We went over on a carrier that it wasn't a carrier, it was a transport that they had made into a helicopter carrier, the USS Croton, probably the slowest ship in the Navy at that particular time. And we were part of the first element that left. And as we were on the ocean, another boat that left a week after we did passed us. So consequently, we called it the slow boat to China.
We landed in Hawaii, and I said, well, let's go to the bar, and we'll get a drink. And we go in the bar and sit down. There was about 5 of us, and 3 or 4 of the guys had never drank before. So I said, what are we going to get to drink? Zombies. And we got these huge zombies. They were about this big. We must have drank about 10 of them in about an hour, and we were just plastered. Went back on the airplane, and there was a colonel in charge of all the people going there, and he was, yelling at us and stuff. And we said, well, what are you going to do? Send us to Vietnam? We're already going, So half the people were sick all the way there. I got there with this rip-roaring headache about midnight, and landed there, and they opened the door, and it was like stepping into a sauna. It was just, boom, this humid stench hit you right in the face, and with that terrific hangover, I'm going, oh my, this is not the way I wanted this to start.
Arriving in country, they were assailed by heat and humidity, unrivaled by anything they had known before. Sights, smells, and sounds were indelibly impressed on their minds.
I think the thing that I remember the most was the smell. A lot of people don't realize this, but in Vietnam, when we were over there, we had no sewage, so we had to, how do I say this? We had to burn our sewage. And we had these big tanks, or they were like 55-gallon drums that were cut about this tall. And we'd pour jet fuel on it. And every night through the whole country, every unit was burning their sewage with jet fuel. And it's a strange smell, the jet fuel mixed with the sewage. And the whole country smells like that. And that was the first thing that struck me, was that smell.
When we first got to Vietnam, I was a little bit concerned. They put us on a bus to take us from the airport to the Long Binh Replacement Center, and we file onto the bus, and I look, and there's heavy chain link or mesh over the windows, and that's so people can't throw grenades onto your bus with the open windows. And I thought, my, that's interesting.
From the replacement depots, the newbies were assigned wherever pilots were needed. Casualties meant there were empty cockpit seats all over Vietnam, and the Army could not afford empty seats. A pilot was a pilot. Sometimes men who had trained in gunships were sent to units flying troop transports, and transport pilots might be sent to fly gunships.
So I get to Vietnam, and I thought I was going to fly Cobras, and I wanted to be in the 101st. And they were going to try to put me into some unit down in Saigon. I didn't want to be down there. So I just got all my stuff and got on a bus that says 101st. And I show up at the 101st, and they said, "You don't have orders here." I said, "I know. I just want to be in the 101st. Well, you could do almost anything in those days. I mean, short of being illegal, immoral, or whatever. And so I signed into the 101st, and 101st, so I said, they were going to send me to a slick unit, Huey's. I said, "I don't want to fly Huey's. I'm a Cobra guy." "You're going to Huey's, son."
Living conditions for the pilots in Vietnam varied greatly depending on what year they were there and where they were assigned. Air cavalry pilots often found themselves camped in tents next to the infantry troops they were there to support. Many units had makeshift huts called hooches for the pilots. These crude shelters were home away from home and were passed down from veteran to newbie as one left and the other arrived.
We had just little individual pup tents initially. It's where how our troops, I'm talking about the officer pilots. This is how they stayed and where they lived. We eventually dug out areas, put up barriers, this type thing, and we lived for our entire year there. We lived in what you call general purpose tents, which is a tent that housed anywhere from 9 to 12 people, depending on how many you put in there.
The base camp that we had, which was part of the entire base camp, we had our own little separate area, was made up of what I would call, permanent structures. They were hooches that were fashioned out of, in some cases, rocket boxes and plywood and shingles and sandbags. So it was not a field environment in the sense that some units had, where they actually lived out of tents. We lived out of really pretty good accommodations in some respects.
Each generation of pilots would beg, borrow, or steal whatever they could to make their living conditions more comfortable.
I actually had my father send an air conditioner over, a small one for my room, and I had him put it in a box and mark Bibles and send it to the Tonsonute Operations Center for Reverend Glenn, and I didn't tell anybody because when they called, I'll never forget the first sergeant said, "Who the hell is Reverend Glenn?" And I said, "Hot dog, the air conditioner's here."
What we moved into might have been somebody's idea of home, but it wasn't our idea of home. So we went around scrounging, and we made off with some lumber, and on the lumber we wrote FBTOH, and that meant filched by transient officers hooch, and that way we identified our lumber. And so we're making repairs and accommodations inside the building, and we noticed that our lumber's getting kind of spare. It's missing. So we walk into the company area, and lo and behold, their lumber is branded FBTOH.
Newbies were the new guys at the officers' club. From practical jokes to flaming shots of liquor, they were put to the test by the old-timers.
When you're the FNG, you know, the new guy, you're like, you know, you're crap. I mean, you're really crap. And they treat you like crap, too. And they harass you. And I got there, and they said, well, it was the evening when I got there, and they offered me a beer. I said, do you want a beer? And I went, sure. And they handed me a hot Miller's in the can. I went, what are you, nuts? I don't drink hot beer. I gave it back to them. They all went, asshole. Right. The next day, I went out flying. We got shot at. Came back. I had a hot Miller's. It was pretty good, actually.
You couldn't wear the company patch unless you drank Blue Flames. And Blue Flames was a shot of whiskey on fire, and you had to drink it down while it was still burning, which was after a while you learned how to do it, but you get it all over your face, and somebody was always standing with a wet towel to put your face out from fire, and you know, guys' mustaches were half burned off, but it was fun, and it was all part of the indoctrination into the company and to get you into the group and so forth.
Helicopter pilots were divided into 5 major categories by the missions they flew: guns, scouts, slicks, dustoff, and heavy lift. Each job made distinct demands on the pilot and his skills. Scout pilots, riding their small helicopters like trackers on horses, crept at treetop level and lower, searching for the enemy hidden in the jungles and swamps. Success in this game of hide-and-seek usually meant they were shot at. This reconnaissance by fire precisely located the enemy.
You're just flying along trying to get somebody to shoot at you so that the gunships can jump on them and blow them up and then call back to wherever and get a battalion of infantry and drop it in on them.
The guns were there to protect the troops with brutal firepower. A gunship pilot had to be aggressive and willing to fight the enemy toe-to-toe to protect their fellow soldiers and pilots regardless of their own personal safety. Guns had to be willing to kill to save American lives.
You know, I never hated the Vietnamese people, I never hated the Viet Cong, never hated the North Vietnamese. But, you know, they were trying to kill me. And I accepted that. But I was trying to kill them too. And I'm pretty sure they accepted that. And it was the mission. They had their mission, I had my mission.
Perhaps the pilots most often associated with Vietnam were the slick pilots, the troop transport pilots. Armed only with door guns manned by their crew chief and gunner, these men flew troops into battle. They flew precision formations to lift as many troops as possible into the tight LZs, even as enemy fire riddled the thin aluminum skin of their Hueys.
You had responsibility of all of the people that were behind you. That was very important. And whatever you did, normally they would do. And you couldn't abort, regardless of whether you saw someone in the LZ shooting at you or not, you had to continue. If you aborted, then you've got 15 ships behind you that are going to abort also. And that's not what your mission was.
Jeeps, trucks, howitzers, crates of ammunition, and even other helicopters were flown all over the country by the heavy lifters.
You could be, for a few hours, picking up ammunition, fuel, water, and delivering it to this fire base from this support area. And then you go to another support area. That's basically what our missions were. We were constantly resupplying fire bases.
Among the bravest, most self-sacrificing of all Army Vietnam helicopter pilots were the medevac flyers, known as Dustoff. Dustoff crews flew completely unarmed Hueys into often very hot LZs to rescue wounded and dying troopers.
The Dustoff mission was very, very satisfying regardless of your politics, because you were always saving someone's life.
1 in 5 Army helicopter pilots was a casualty in Vietnam. Even the most experienced pilots were killed or wounded simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Missions that looked simple at the briefing often escalated into a harrowing series of near misses with death.
We had a team that we had inserted, I believe it was in Laos, or very close to the Laotian border, and we went back to retrieve them because they had got into a little bit of trouble. I'm hovering into the trees, I'm kind of sinking down a bit so that actually the rotor blades were very close to hitting the tops of the branches. And What I remember most clearly was that after the ropes were dropped, they got tangled up in the trees. So my crew chief and door gunner, they were frantically trying to untangle the ropes and get them straight and drop them further down where they could be reached. But the tree line outside was full of Viet Cong and NVA, and they were laying down very heavy fire at us. And I remember seeing these branches, because I had no door, and they were the rounds were hitting the branches, and it was just, I could see ping, ting, bing, bing, and bark was flying, hitting me in the face, and just filling my lap with pieces of bark. We had Cobra gunships that were laying down suppressive fire, and there were some Air Force fighter jets that were laying down some napalm in order to suppress the fire and give us some cover. But still, they clocked us. We hovered there for 8 minutes, over 8 minutes, before we were able to get the ropes untangled, to get the men connected and hooked up and pull them straight up and get out of there. And one man got hit in the leg as we came up, but our aircraft didn't take any rounds that I can recall. And how they were hitting these trees, I guess they were coming from this direction and that direction, but I didn't get hit. None of my crew members were hit. Just the trees were hit.
So I'd only been in country not even a week. When we landed, they have L-shaped revetments, and revetments they're about 4 or 5 feet tall, and they protect the helicopters when there's a rocket attack. When the helicopter in front of me was turning to park, he stuck his tail rotor into the revetment. When the tail rotor hit the revetment, it pitched the nose of the helicopter down, and the main rotor blade struck the ground. When the rotor blade broke and hit the ground, they came apart, and it broke the transmission in the transmission well loose, and the transmission fell forward into the helicopter, and the stabilizer bar came through and chewed through the top of the cockpit and hit the pilot in the right seat in the back of the helmet. I jumped out. It was one of the first 2 or 3 people to get up to the helicopter, and the medics were there with their sirens and everything very quick. And the medic pushed us out of the way. He took the helmet off the pilot, and as soon as he did, he saw a little trickle of blood coming out of the pilot's ear. And I'll never forget, he just took the helmet and slung it down and went, well, he's dead. I hadn't even gotten my in-country check ride. I hadn't heard a round go off. And here was a pilot who he happened to have less than 2 weeks left in country, and he killed himself at a 3-foot hover.
We were scrambled because an American unit from the 1st of the 1st Cavalry, was in heavy contact, and it called for air support. I thought I spotted a fighting position because the North Vietnamese used to dig these distinctive kinds of donut hole positions for their heavy caliber machine guns, their 51 caliber machine guns. And we started making passes at that position, and we were getting reports from the ground that that was in fact where the enemy fire had been coming from. Well, lo and behold, it turned out that it was really a classic setup, a classic what they called air ambush, where the North Vietnamese would use 1 or 2 heavy caliber machine guns as the bait, and then they'd set up a 3rd or a 4th or how many ever heavy machine guns that they had for flanking engagement of the helicopters, so that they had more to shoot at. And on about the 2nd or 3rd pass, we were nailed from the side, as if the Jolly Green Giant had reached up and just hit the aircraft a lick. I mean, you just really felt a big shudder, and almost immediately the wingman started yelling on the radio that we were trailing smoke and flames. So we immediately lined up for a rice dike. On the way down, when I looked out to the side, I could see Vietnamese soldiers up and moving towards our position. They're going to try to either kill us or capture us. It was obvious. And we spent a little bit of time on the ground while they set up the Huey that always flew with us for just this type of circumstance to make a pass in and try to pick us up. And they eventually did this. I mean, within probably 5 minutes of us being on the ground, the Huey did make a quick touchdown, and Bob and I ran off, jumped in, and flew off, and were taken back to Chulai, where we picked up another Cobra and came back out to try it again.
All the missions were important in some way to the troops on the ground, and every mission could be deadly.
This was literally one of these, hey, launch guys, and we'll give you further instructions on the radio. You got a radio call to proceed to Ben Het. By the time we got to Ben Het, that whole camp had been overrun by NVA infantry. There were 5 Soviet-built tanks in the wire at Ben Het. We were asked to escort a UH-1 into Ben Het to drop off an emergency resupply of ammunition to include anti-tank ammo to these besieged guys on the ground. They were just about out of ammunition and had no more anti-tank ammunition and were in dire need of a resupply. Because of the anti-aircraft threat, because of the weather, we elected to go in right at Treetop. So we came screaming in right at Treetop into Ben Het, going right for the bunker complex. We had the Huey in the lead. I was lead gun. My wingman was back here. As we went in, we were shooting rockets. My front seater was shooting the turret, the minigun, and the 40-millimeter grenade launcher, which we called a chunker, shooting the chunker. The Huey got in. The Huey dropped off his load of ammunition, kicked it off for these guys. He kicked his pedal around and came out. As he was coming out, we turned to provide supporting fire for him. And just as I got through most of that turn, from just about my 4 o'clock position, I started taking fire from what appeared to be about a 12.7 51 caliber type of weapon. Shot me, and then I began getting engaged from another weapon of about that same caliber and started taking hits. I was not a stranger to taking hits in an aircraft. I'd taken hits many times. Most of the times, my correlation to small arms hits is if you imagine a Jiffy Pop popcorn going in one of those old aluminum things and you hear the popcorn hitting that tin foil, that was a lot what it sounded like. This fire that I was receiving this day was more like someone was on a scaffold outside the aircraft with a jackhammer starting at the back of the aircraft, going pum, 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 just working right up that aircraft. The first thing to go was my directional control. The tail rotor tail rotor control was gone, and I don't know what components I lost back there. Rounds started coming up through the engine compartment. I lost the engine. We were burning, and rounds came through the cockpit. I was wounded in the ankle. My front seater took wounds also. The aircraft at this point was spinning and burning, and RPM was dropping off dramatically, and I entered auto rotation, trying to salvage whatever we could and effect a landing that we could survive. The aircraft was spinning violently, hit nose low on the left side, bounced up, spun another turn and a half, and then settled in. The flames were immediately all around the cockpit. I called to my front seater, and to paraphrase, I would say something along the lines of, let's get out of this thing. Somehow I got out of the helicopter. I had broken my back in the crash. I had taken a smack on the head. I was hurt badly, but I got out of there. I don't know exactly how. My front seater also somehow got out of the aircraft, but we never did get together on the ground. I wandered to the right, he wandered to the left. I made it for 3 days of escape and evasion without being able to get recovered and eventually getting captured.
The pilots seldom knew what lay beneath the dense triple canopy of the Vietnam jungles, and every flight could be their last.
And we were working in an area just southwest of Saigon. I was, fairly new at being a scout. I'd only been a scout for a couple months and probably a full-fledged scout for maybe 45 days. And I was following tennis shoe tracks. You can actually see the tennis shoe treads. And I'm hovering along, and we were probably about 8 or 10 feet above the ground. And I'm talking to the Cobra saying, yeah, we got some tennis shoe tracks down here, and it looks like they're dragging something. And I was looking down, not looking up, and out of the corner of my eye, I see a figure stand up. This guy pops up. It was amazing. I mean, no more than 20 feet. Pointed this AK. When I looked at him, it was pointing directly at me, and you could see the muzzle flashes. fired a full clip AK-47 right at us, never touched us. I don't know how.
We got a mission to fly, an emergency mission to support some South Vietnamese soldiers that had been in contact and had taken a lot of wounded. They were no longer in contact with the enemy, but they had been in contact with the enemy a short time before that. So I decided to do one of my usual dust-off approaches, dove down and was making what I would call my final right-hand turn just above the treetops to sweep into a final approach into this LZ just as fast as I could go. And it was while I was in that turn, and I was really honked up. It was close as you could get to about a 90-degree bank. I mean, I had really torqued this thing over. So the whole right side of my body was laying kind of parallel to the ground. And geez, everything just opened up on us. I mean, we must have been flying right over the top of the bad guys. And I mean, it just all kinds of shooting. I mean, we were just getting hit over and over and over again. It was happening very quickly. I immediately aborted the landing and put the aircraft into a climb. And as I was climbing, I realized I was hit. And I turned to my co-pilot, a young gentleman by the name of Denny Derber, and I said to Denny, Denny, I'm hit. And he said, yeah, I'm hit too, boss. I go, oh, jeez. So if he's hit, then I got to keep flying, but I know I'm not doing a real good job flying. And then a second later, he said, no, I'm okay. And so he took the helicopter, and I reached down and I grabbed my right arm, and I remember picking it up like this and looking down, and about 1.5 inches below my elbow was a hole that I could see daylight through. And I thought, ooh, I really don't like looking at this, and I laid it back down in my lap. And it turns out, I don't know how true this is, but it was told to me that we had taken 39 hits in the helicopter. Just about everybody on board had some kind of shrapnel wound, but I was the only one that took a direct hit. I didn't understand what happened to Denny. Well, it turned out what happened to Denny is that bullet passed in to the aircraft. It came through the right door, went through my arm, up across my chest without hitting me, and over the top of Denny's shoulder, but blew part of the bone out of my body into his shoulder. So the pain he felt was not a bullet, but it was actually bone from my arm.
And I flew over this little village, and one of my crew chiefs said, you know, I think I saw a weapon leaning on the door, one of the observers. So I came back around, and sure enough, there was a rifle leaning on the door. So we just immediately, and this is the way we operated, we just immediately pulled out and put gunships on it. And the gunships, you know, fired, made one pass shooting rockets and minigun into it, and then we went back. And there was a guy laying on the ground right outside the hooch. And I just flew over him. Wasn't very high and wasn't going terribly slow, but wasn't going really fast. And this guy just rolled over on his back and laced us. We were maybe 20 feet above him. Well, he got all three of us. And my foot was actually knocked off the pedal. It's hard to explain, but there's a little small center console in OH-6. And my right foot was knocked off the pedal and up on top of the console. So we were going so slow that when my foot came off the pedal, my left foot pushed the left pedal in, the aircraft started spinning. Well, my crew chief had been hit in the arm, but he put his feet on the pedals just immediately and, stopped it so we could fly it. And the guy in the back had been shot too. And so we flew over to the little fire base where the infantry was, and, hey guys, we found them. And they medevaced us. And I was just shot through the foot, nice clean hole in my foot and some shrapnel in my leg, so I was flying again in 3 weeks. But, dead guys aren't always dead. The AK-47 has a 20-round magazine, and we had 18 holes in the bottom of our aircraft.
There was a landing zone, Lolo, that we went into. That particular approach was probably the most scared I'd ever been the whole time that I was in Vietnam. And I went in as fast as I could. I got into the LZ. The time-space continuum slowed down. It was almost like I could count the rotor blades. And the aircraft was rocking from side to side. And I'm thinking, it's okay, it's okay, it's the Arvins jumping out and they're changing the center of gravity and the ship's rocking. Well, it wasn't. It was because we were taking hits and hard points in the aircraft. As soon as the crew chief gave me a heads up that everybody was out of the aircraft, I pulled power until I cleared the tree line. My co-pilot, I don't know if words were coming out of his mouth or not, but I could see him pointing, and I knew he was pointing at the instrument panel because I was pulling power. When you're flying, Huey, by the seat of your pants, when you get close to 50 pounds of torque, when you pull power, the aircraft starts to talk to you. There's a cyclical groan that you can hear as all the components are stressed against each other. I held the power until I cleared the trees. When I cleared the trees, I nosed over and took a little power out, and that's when I first looked inside the aircraft at the instrument panel. Everything was good except for the transmission oil pressure. That needle was fluctuating wildly. I broke left to head for home. When we came back to Quezon, when I lowered the collective to initiate my approach, the transmission oil pressure dropped to 0. When I got it to the ground, after we shut it down, we looked at what was left of the aircraft, and there was a tremendous amount of damage. We'd taken several bursts. The last burst put a hole in the transmission just about big enough for you to stick your fist into, and that's where we lost all the fluid that caused our pressure to fluctuate.
When the troops needed helicopters, pilots were famous for going, regardless of weather conditions, firefights, or in some cases, against orders to do so.
During the monsoon, you would have rain and low clouds and low visibility for weeks and weeks and weeks without a good weather day before you could go take off and go fly. And these people, they were on tops of mountains and these fire bases, and they would really get in a bad position after a couple weeks without being resupplied with food or ammo or to take the wounded out. And I know I did it every now and then. You just, what they call, you push the envelope. You know you're not supposed to fly in this bad weather, but you know how bad it is for them up on top of that mountain. And so you fly what's the nap of the earth. You scud, you run in the low clouds and low visibility, and you just kind of hug the side of the mountain, and you finally get up to where you can land, and you resupply them. And more than once, you'd land and they would be so happy to see you. They'd run up and they'd just stick their face in the window, and they'd grab a hold of you and plant a big kiss on you. And they didn't smell very good, though, I gotta tell you that. But it was a little male bonding that was just okay.
I loved the grunts. That's the only reason that we existed, was to put smiles on their faces and get them out of harm's way and get them to hospitals. They're indescribable as far as what they went through. We experienced as the airmen nothing compared to what our grunts endured.
I'll tell you, if there were soldiers on the ground, your mission was to help them, to get them ammunition, to evacuate them. You never thought any other way. Never. I mean, it would be night. I can recall literally flying through cloud banks because that's how they were, and then you'd get through the top, you'd be on the top to go out and take supplies to people on a hill or to evacuate them from a hill site someplace like that. That's the only reason. It's the only reason any force exists, is to support the infantrymen on the ground.
Life in the various aviation units in Vietnam was as different as their missions, but for most of them the stresses were the same. The shock of losing close friends, the uncertainty of surviving, wonder at the conduct and purpose of the war, all took their toll.
Truly the hardest part was losing your friends. And knowing that you could be next.
I mean, I can remember some mornings getting up and laying in my bunk there for a little bit thinking, gee, you know, today would be a good day to go on sick call. And just take a break because you haven't had a break for several days. But I was, for me, I was thinking, gee, if the first time you do that, that would be the end. You just cannot do that. So, you get up and you press on.
And for me, the very worst parts that I remember were when we would get ready to go on what I knew to be a hot assault, what I knew to be plenty of bad guys out there for us. And we'd get all set to go, and then they'd call a halt to it and leave us sit on the ground while something developed. Those periods were probably the worst. When you fly in the helicopter in formation and you're on the assault and what have you, you're just too busy to really worry about what's going on. There's absolutely no time to worry about yourself or to worry about anything except the task at hand, and that is to control the helicopter and get it on the ground. But when you know that there's a hot LZ waiting for you, and you've got minutes or maybe hours, and in a couple of cases, a couple of days to kill, it really weighed heavily on you. It really weighed heavily on us.
There was a lieutenant who came to me one day and said, was in my platoon when I was in the 48th, and said, sir, I just can't fly today. If I fly today, I'm going to die. Just know I'm not going to be good. I'm going to be a danger. And he literally said he wanted to turn his wings in. He didn't want to fly anymore. He just couldn't do it. And I said, well, we don't have enough people. You can't not fly. You got to fly. You just can't not go. I got to have you go. And they said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll swap with you. Because I was supposed to fly the CNC ship with company commander, and so I swapped places with him. And I flew the assault. He flew the CNC ship. And they got hit with a SA-7, and they all got killed. And to this day, that's one of those experiences where you just think about it and say, golly, why was it him and not me? And why did he do that? And why did that happen? And that's one of those things you think about. It's just kind of locked there in your head for the rest of your life.
The value and purpose of the war in Vietnam has been hotly debated since its conclusion nearly 3 decades ago. But despite the criticisms, the fact remains that Army helicopter pilots flew with honor in a war that honored few.
That year of my life was the best year ever in my life. If I could do it over again, I'd do it 1,000 times. This sounds dumb, but if you weren't killed, at least to me, Vietnam was a great experience. It was a beautiful country. I didn't believe in what we were doing, but that was not my call. I was just told to go do it.
I have absolutely no regret at all. I've always been proud of the service, proud that I was there, and frankly, I wouldn't trade it for anything. And if the balloon went up again and I wasn't 53 years old and overweight, I'd go do it again.
Well, the lessons I learned or the impact on my life from that experience, oh gosh, there's many, 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 many things. I guess at the bottom of it all is the pure joy that I have for living. After surviving all that, I wake up every single day of my life, look out the window and say, thank you, Lord, for another day on this good green earth.
I think that we had the troops and that we had the equipment and the warfare to win the war. This is my opinion. I think as everyone has surmised that it was a lot of politics involved in that war.
Well, the travesty is that we wasted so many lives over there for very little actual accomplishment. I mean, that's a loss to the world, not just to us personally, but to have all those people die for nothing over there, just for the sake of the politics of North and South Vietnam and the kind of the greater Cold War politics that were influencing all of that at the time. That's a shame. Just think of the loss. What might have been for some of those people who were killed.
You fought together. You seen and did experiences together. You're tight, and when one of those doesn't come home, you feel guilty. I think one is it's like I can kiss my wife, I can hold my hands with my children. I'm enjoying all these experiences that they made possible for me, and not just me, all our fellow countrymen. You walk down to the wall, you see those names. Those people paid the ultimate price.
Why I stayed alive and others died who I don't know. Whatever it was in the cards. And I would like to say this too. I have a son now and I have a beautiful granddaughter. And When I go to the Vietnam Memorial Wall and I look at all those names, what strikes me is how many children were not born, how many of those men would have had children and grandchildren that will never exist. And for whatever the reason is that I stayed alive and now have a beautiful granddaughter and wonderful son, I'm very happy for it, and I thank God, and I never, ever, ever take it for granted. Never.
Saber wings will lift us when we get the call. Through the dawn like eagles we will soar. Roll the pitch and throttle, cycling to the wall. Listen to the Army Eagles roar. We're winged soldiers, we fly above the pest. Defenders of the land and the free. From the sky we do or die and let the angels rest. Winged soldiers are we, charging through the jungle. Hear our rotors roar, down from in the valley toward the hill. Fighting aviators, out to win the war. Here comes the Army's escadrille. We're winged soldiers, we fly above the best. Defenders of the land and the free. From the sky we do or die and let the angels rest. Winged soldiers are we. Rotor blades are churning, diving toward the fire, screaming in like eagles for the kill. After our inferno, troopers must admire, eagles of the Army's escadrille.
Funding for this program has been provided by Bell Helicopter Textron, Boeing, Sikorsky, a United Technologies company, Panasonic Broadcast and Television Systems Company, Legend Airlines, and Carpel Video. To purchase a copy of this program, please call 1-800-553-7752